The blistering sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky as Penelope Watson urged her exhausted horse forward, her parched throat burning with each labored breath she took. 2 days without proper water, 3 without a decent meal, and the unrelenting Dakota Territory summer had taken its toll on her usually resilient spirit. It was July 1879, and Penelope, 22 years old and completely alone, had never imagined her journey west would end like this. The stagecoach robbery 2 days prior had left her stranded miles from Custer, South Dakota, with nothing but the clothes on her back, her father's pocket watch tucked safely in her bodice, and the letter of employment that had brought her west from Philadelphia in the first place. "Just a little farther," she whispered to her horse, a borrowed mare she'd acquired from a kindly farmer who'd taken pity on her situation yesterday morning. The animal was nearly as spent as she was, trudging forward with heavy steps along the dusty trail. In the distance, Penelope could make out what appeared to be a small ranch house, smoke curling from its chimney despite the summer heat. Hope fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird as she squinted against the glare, willing her vision to clear. Was it real, or merely another cruel mirage produced by heat and desperation? Her head pounded relentlessly. The world tilted sideways, trees and sky trading places as she slid from the saddle. The last thing Penelope remembered was the sight of a tall figure emerging from the cabin door, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, before darkness claimed her completely. Ethan Hayes had been finishing his coffee when he heard the sound of hooves approaching his property. Living alone as he did, 15 miles outside of Custer, visitors were rare enough to put him on alert. He set down his cup, grabbed his rifle from its place beside the door more out of habit than any real sense of danger, and stepped onto the porch. What he saw made him drop the weapon and sprint forward, a woman slumping from her saddle, her body crumpling to the ground like a marionette with cut strings. Her horse stood listlessly beside her, head hung low, clearly as exhausted as its rider. "Madam," Ethan called, kneeling beside the fallen woman. Her skin was hot to the touch, face flushed an alarming red beneath streaks of dust and dirt. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Heat exhaustion, possibly sunstroke. He'd seen it before, and without treatment it could kill. Without hesitation, Ethan gathered the unconscious woman into his arms. She weighed hardly anything, seeming small and fragile against his broad chest as he carried her toward his cabin. Later, he would tend to her horse, but for now, the woman needed immediate attention. Inside, the cabin was mercifully cooler, the thick log walls providing insulation against the summer heat. Ethan carried her directly to his bedroom, gently laying her upon his quilt-covered bed. He removed her boots and loosened the high collar of her traveling dress to help her breathe easier, but propriety prevented him from doing more. Ethan retrieved a basin of cool water and clean cloths, placing them on the bedside table. With careful movements, he bathed her face and neck, hoping to bring down her temperature. Only when the immediate crisis seemed to pass did he take a moment to truly look at her. She was young, perhaps early 20s, with auburn hair that had partially escaped its pins to curl damply around her face. Her features were delicate straight nose, full lips now parched and cracked from dehydration, and long lashes resting against flushed cheeks. Even in her disheveled state, there was something striking about her. "Rest now," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "You're safe here." Ethan rose to his feet, intent on tending to her horse and preparing something for when she woke. As he reached the doorway, he paused, looking back at the unexpected visitor who had literally fallen at his doorstep. Something told him his solitary life had just become considerably more complicated. When Penelope finally opened her eyes, confusion was her first sensation. The ceiling above her wasn't the endless blue sky she'd last remembered, but rough-hewn timber. She lay on something soft, a bed, and a quilt covered her body. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something savory that made her empty stomach clench painfully. Attempting to sit up proved to be a mistake. Her head swam, and a soft groan escaped her lips before she could prevent it. "Easy there," came a deep voice from somewhere to her right. Startled, Penelope turned to find a man rising from a chair beside the bed. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a lean build hardened by physical labor. His face was tanned and weathered by the elements, with strong features framed by dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes, a clear hazel that reminded her of sunlight through whiskey, regarded her with concern. "Where am I?" Her voice emerged as a raspy whisper, her throat painfully dry. "My ranch about 15 miles outside of Custer," he answered, reaching for a cup of water on the bedside table. "You collapsed at my doorstep about 4 hours ago. Here, drink this, slowly now." He supported her head with a gentle hand as she sipped the water, which tasted better than the finest wine after her ordeal. "Thank you," she managed, once she'd drunk enough to soothe her parched throat. "I'm Penelope Watson. I was headed to Custer when I—" She faltered, embarrassment coloring her already flushed cheeks. "When you fainted from exhaustion," he finished for her. "I'm Ethan Hayes. It's lucky you made it this far. Not much between here and Deadwood but open country." "My horse, she's fine. Fed, watered, and resting in the barn. Better shape than you were, truth be told." There was no mockery in his voice, just simple fact. Penelope nodded, relief washing through her. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Hayes." "Ethan," he corrected. "And no thanks needed. Couldn't exactly leave you out there to bake in the sun." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Think you could manage some broth? You look like you haven't eaten in days." "That would be wonderful, Ethan." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her conscious of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of their situation. She was alone in a strange man's home in his bed, no less. If she'd been back in Philadelphia, her reputation would have been irreparably ruined. But this wasn't Philadelphia, and right now, survival trumped propriety. While Ethan went to fetch the broth, Penelope took stock of her surroundings. The bedroom was simple but tidy, with a washstand, chest of drawers, and the chair Ethan had occupied. Through the open doorway, she could glimpse a larger room that appeared to serve as both kitchen and living area. When Ethan returned with a steaming bowl, Penelope had managed to prop herself up against the pillows. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the bowl, but she was determined not to appear completely helpless. "Small sips," he advised, settling back into the chair. "Your stomach needs to remember what food is." She nodded, focusing on the task. The broth was rich and flavorful, warming her from the inside out. As she ate, Ethan asked about her journey, and Penelope found herself telling him about the teaching position she'd accepted in Custer, the stagecoach robbery that had left her stranded, and her desperate trek across unfamiliar territory. "The driver and guard were killed," she said quietly, the memory still raw. "The other passengers, an elderly couple and a salesman, were robbed but not harmed. We were left on the road with nothing but what the thieves didn't want." The nearest town was 2 days back the way we'd come, but Custer was only supposed to be another day's journey ahead. The others decided to turn back, but I— She paused, realizing how foolish her decision must sound. "You decided to push forward," Ethan finished, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "Yes. I need this position, Mr. Hayes, Ethan. There's nothing for me back east anymore, and the school term starts in 2 weeks. I couldn't risk losing this opportunity." Ethan nodded, seeming to understand the unspoken weight behind her words. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're recovered enough to continue to Custer. I can take you there myself when you're ready." Relief flooded through Penelope. "That's very kind. I promise I won't impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's no imposition, Miss Watson." "Penelope, please," she insisted, finding herself returning his smile despite her exhaustion. "After all, it seems only fair since you've already seen me at my worst." For the first time, Ethan's smile reached his eyes, transforming his rugged features. "I doubt that was your worst, Penelope, but I appreciate the sentiment." As twilight descended over the Dakota prairie, Penelope drifted back to sleep, the sound of Ethan moving about the cabin oddly comforting. Her last conscious thought was that despite the dire circumstances that had brought her here, she felt safer than she had in a very long time. The next morning, Penelope woke feeling considerably better. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, casting golden patterns across the quilt. For a moment, she simply lay there, taking inventory of her body. The pounding headache had receded to a dull throb, and while she still felt weak, the desperate thirst and confusion of the previous day had abated. Slowly, she sat up, relieved when the room remained steady. The scent of coffee and frying bacon drifted through the open door, accompanied by the quiet sounds of Ethan moving about the kitchen. Penelope glanced down at her rumpled traveling dress, grimacing at its sorry state. Dirt streaked the once navy fabric and the hemline was torn in several places from her journey. A soft knock at the doorframe drew her attention. Ethan stood there, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. "Thought you might be awake," he said, offering her the cup. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Much improved, thank you," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Though I'm afraid I'm not much presentable." Ethan's gaze flickered briefly over her disheveled appearance, but there was no judgment in his expression. "I set out some water for washing up. And I have a spare shirt you could use while your dress dries. I noticed it got a bit damp when I was trying to cool you down yesterday." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks at the reminder of her vulnerable state, but she nodded. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." "Breakfast will be ready when you are," he said, retreating from the doorway to give her privacy. After he left, Penelope took a moment to gather her strength before rising from the bed. Her legs felt unsteady, but they supported her weight as she made her way to the washstand where Ethan had left a basin of clean water, a bar of simple soap, and a folded shirt that would dwarf her small frame. The cool water felt heavenly against her skin as she washed away the grime of her journey. She managed to salvage her underthings, though they were in nearly as sorry a state as her dress. The shirt Ethan had left was made of soft, faded blue cotton, worn with washing but meticulously clean. When she put it on, it hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips until she rolled them up, with her hair combed and rebraided using her own hairpins. Penelope felt almost human again. She hesitated before leaving the bedroom, acutely aware of the impropriety of appearing before a man she barely knew wearing his shirt. But the rumbling of her stomach convinced her that propriety would have to bend to necessity once more. Ethan glanced up from the stove when she emerged, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly looked away. "There's a seat for you at the table," he said, nodding toward the simple wooden table set with two mismatched plates. "Thank you," Penelope said, making her way carefully to the chair. "For everything. I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't found your ranch." "Let's just be glad you did," he replied simply, bringing over a pan of bacon and eggs. "Eat while it's hot. You need your strength back." As they ate, Penelope found herself studying her host when he wasn't looking. In the clear light of morning, she could see that Ethan was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps late 20s or early 30s. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his movements were precise and careful. There was a quietness about him that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. Ethan nodded. 5 years. Came out from Missouri after the war, wanted open space and quiet after. He trailed off, then shrugged. "Worked on other ranches until I saved enough to buy this place." The mention of the war explained a lot about the man sitting across from her. Though the war between the states had ended 14 years ago, its shadow still stretched long across the nation. Penelope had been just a child when it ended, but she'd seen the hollow-eyed men who returned to Philadelphia, forever changed by what they'd experienced. "It's a beautiful piece of land," she offered, sensing he didn't wish to elaborate. Something in Ethan's expression softened. "It is that. 160 acres, courtesy of the Homestead Act. Not the richest soil, but good enough for what I need. Got about 30 head of cattle now, a few horses. It's a modest living, but it's mine." There was pride in his voice, and Penelope found herself smiling in response. "That's no small accomplishment." "What about you?" he asked, refilling her coffee cup. "Teaching's a respectable profession, but what brings a young woman all the way from Philadelphia to a town like Custer?" Penelope's smile faded. She stared down at her half-empty plate, debating how much to share. "My father died last winter," she finally said. "Influenza. He was a professor at the university, languages and literature. After he was gone, I discovered his finances weren't what I'd believed. The house had to be sold to cover his debts." She took a deep breath, surprised at how difficult it still was to speak of it. "I've been teaching since I was 18 at a small ladies' seminary in Philadelphia, but without a home and with the memories. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Custer, it seemed like a sign, a chance to start fresh somewhere new." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The West is good for new beginnings." "So I've heard," Penelope replied, attempting a lighter tone. "Though I admit, my introduction to Dakota Territory hasn't been quite what I expected." That earned her a chuckle from Ethan, the sound warming the room. "Most people's isn't. The Territory has a way of testing newcomers, seeing what they're made of. And have I passed the test, do you think?" she asked, only half joking. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady and appraising. "You're still here, aren't you? That's more than can be said for plenty who have tried their luck out here." After breakfast, Penelope insisted on helping with the dishes despite Ethan's protests that she should rest. She could feel her strength returning with each passing hour, though she was still far from fully recovered. "I've been caring for myself since I was a child," she told him firmly, taking the dish towel from his hands. "My mother died when I was 7, and my father was often lost in his books. I'm not accustomed to being idle." Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "Fair enough, but promise you'll sit down if you start feeling light-headed." "I promise," she agreed, pleased when he didn't try to coddle her further. As they worked together in the small kitchen, Penelope became increasingly aware of Ethan's presence beside her. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. And though he wasn't overly talkative, his silence never felt awkward or strained. "Will your school be expecting you?" he asked as he handed her the last plate to dry. "Not until next week," Penelope replied. "I'd planned to arrive early to settle in and prepare for the term, but I'm not officially due until Monday after next." Ethan nodded. "Good. You should take at least another day to rest before attempting the ride to town. I can take you in on Saturday if you're feeling up to it by then." "That's very kind, but I've imposed on your hospitality enough already." It's no imposition, he said firmly. Besides, I need to go into town anyway for supplies. Been putting it off, but I'm nearly out of flour and coffee. Penelope suspected this was at least partly a fabrication to make her feel less indebted, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. In that case, I accept your offer. Thank you. Later that afternoon, after Penelope had rested, Ethan showed her around the small ranch. The main cabin was surrounded by several outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a small bunkhouse that Ethan explained had been built with the intention of hiring help someday. "Do you manage all this alone?" Penelope asked, impressed by the well-maintained property. "For now," Ethan replied. "It's not much compared to some of the larger spreads around here, but it keeps me busy." He led her toward the corral where several horses grazed, including her borrowed mare. "Your horse is doing fine, by the way. Another day of rest and good feed, and she'll be ready for the ride to Custer." "I'm glad to hear it," Penelope said, reaching out to stroke the mare's velvety nose. "I'm afraid I didn't even ask the farmer who lent her to me for her name." "Horses don't much care what we call them, so long as they're treated kindly," Ethan remarked. His gaze softened as he looked at the animals. "These are good company on quiet nights." There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness perhaps, that made Penelope look at him more closely. "Don't you ever get lonely out here by yourself?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Used to be. I preferred my own company to most others. After the war, well, crowds didn't sit well with me anymore." He shrugged. "But I've been thinking lately that it might be nice to have someone to share a conversation with at the end of the day." His honesty surprised her. Men she'd known in Philadelphia rarely admitted to such feelings, viewing them as weaknesses rather than natural human desires. "I understand," she said softly. "Even surrounded by students and colleagues at the seminary, I often felt alone after my father died. There's a difference between being among people and truly connecting with them." Ethan's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, of mutual understanding that needed no words. Then he cleared his throat and turned back toward the cabin. "Sun's getting low. We should head back. I've got some stew that needs tending." As they walked back, side by side in the golden late afternoon light, Penelope found herself sneaking glances at the tall, quiet man beside her. In just one day, she'd begun to sense there were depths to Ethan Hayes that few people were privileged to see. Despite the circumstances that had brought her to his door, she found herself curious to learn more about the solitary rancher who had taken her in without question. That evening, after a hearty dinner of venison stew and biscuits, they sat before the fireplace with cups of coffee. Outside, the temperature had dropped considerably, a reminder that even summer nights could be chilly in the high country. "Tell me about Custer," Penelope said, curling her legs beneath her on the worn armchair Ethan had insisted she take. "What sort of place am I heading to?" Ethan leaned back in his straight-backed chair, considering. "It's growing like most towns out here since they found gold in the Black Hills. Not as wild as Deadwood, but not exactly Philadelphia either." He smiled slightly. "Good people mostly, the kind who look out for their neighbors. The school's new built just last year when they decided the town was permanent enough to warrant educating the children properly. And the children themselves, what should I expect? Farm kids mostly, ranch children. A few from town shopkeepers' youngsters, the doctor's son, miners' children. They'll be tough but fair, I'd wager. Out here, children grow up faster from necessity." Penelope nodded. "I suspected as much. It will be different from teaching young ladies their French verbs and watercolor techniques." "You might find it refreshing," Ethan suggested. "These children value education because they know its worth. It's not something taken for granted." "I hope you're right," she replied. I want to do well by them. You seem the type who wouldn't accept anything less from yourself, Ethan observed, his hazel eyes reflecting the dancing flames from the fireplace. Penelope felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. There was something about the way Ethan looked at her, truly saw her, that was both unnerving and exhilarating. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "You mentioned you came from Missouri. Do you have family there still?" A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "No. Lost my parents before the war. Typhoid took them both within weeks of each other. Had an older brother, Samuel, but he fell at Gettysburg. I was the only one who came home." "I'm so sorry," Penelope said softly, her heart aching for the losses he'd endured. No wonder he sought solitude. He'd lost everyone. Ethan shrugged, the gesture not dismissive but rather an acknowledgement that grief was simply part of his story now. "It was a long time ago." "Some wounds don't heal with time," Penelope said. "They just become part of us." He looked at her then, surprise and something else flickering in his eyes. Yes, that's exactly it." The conversation flowed more easily after that, moving to lighter topics. Ethan told her about his first winter in Dakota Territory, when he'd nearly frozen trying to rescue a calf during a blizzard. Penelope shared stories of her more precocious students at the seminary, including one who had released a frog in the dormitory to avoid a Latin examination. By the time they bid each other good night, Penelope realized she'd laughed more in one evening than she had in the past year. There was an ease to being with Ethan that defied explanation, considering they were still virtually strangers. Yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt forming between them, tentative and unexpected, but undeniably real. As she settled into Ethan's bed, despite his insistence that he was perfectly comfortable in the bunkhouse, Penelope found herself wondering what would have happened if circumstances had been different. If she had come to Dakota Territory not as a schoolteacher bound for Custer, but as a woman free to follow her heart. The thought startled her with its presumption. One evening of pleasant conversation hardly constituted the foundation for such fanciful thinking. Yet as sleep claimed her, Penelope couldn't help but wonder if Ethan Hayes might be thinking similar thoughts in his bunkhouse across the yard. The next day dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Penelope woke feeling almost completely recovered, the fatigue and weakness of the previous days merely a lingering memory. Her dress, which Ethan had gallantly washed and hung to dry, was waiting for her, folded neatly on the chair beside the bed. After dressing and arranging her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, Penelope made her way to the main room where she found a pot of coffee waiting on the stove, but no sign of Ethan. Through the window, she could see him in the corral, working with a young horse that pranced nervously as he approached it with a saddle. Penelope poured herself coffee and stepped onto the porch, content to watch Ethan work. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved around the skittish animal, confident, but never aggressive, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to where she stood, but clearly had a calming effect on the horse. When the horse finally accepted the saddle without protest, Ethan patted its neck approvingly before noticing Penelope on the porch. He raised a hand in greeting, and after securing the horse to the fence post, made his way toward her. "Good morning," he called as he approached. "Hope I didn't wake you. That filly needs work if she's going to be ready for riding before winter." "You didn't wake me at all," Penelope assured him. "I've been enjoying watching you work. You have a way with horses." Ethan's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "They're honest creatures. Let you know exactly where you stand with them. No pretense." He climbed the porch steps, removing his hat as he did so. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better," Penelope replied honestly. "Almost myself again. Good. Thought we might ride out a bit today if you're up for it. Nothing strenuous, he added quickly, seeing her surprise. Just to get you back in the saddle before the trip to town tomorrow. Make sure you're steady. Penelope nodded, secretly pleased at the prospect of spending more time with Ethan. That sounds wonderful. I'd like to properly thank you for your hospitality. No thanks necessary, he said, the phrase becoming familiar between them. But if you're determined, you could help me with breakfast. I make a decent flapjack, but I've been told my technique lacks a woman's touch. I'd be happy to assist, Penelope said, following him into the cabin with a smile. Though I should warn you, my father often claimed my cooking was the one area where my education was sorely lacking. Ethan chuckled. Can't be worse than army rations. Those would make a grown man weep. Together, they prepared a breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and fried apples that Ethan produced from his root cellar. Working alongside him in the small kitchen felt surprisingly natural, as if they'd established a routine over months rather than mere days. After breakfast, true to his word, Ethan saddled 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a gentle chestnut mare that he assured Penelope was perfect for a rider still regaining her strength. Not your borrowed horse, he explained as he helped her mount. She deserves another day of rest. This is Maple. She's been with me since I started this place. Penelope settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts as best she could. She'd ridden occasionally in Philadelphia, but always side saddle and in proper riding attire. Here, necessity dictated a more practical approach, even if it meant her dress hiked scandalously above her ankles. She's lovely, Penelope said, stroking the mare's glossy neck. The horse nickered softly, as if in agreement. Ethan swung easily into his own saddle. We'll take it slow, follow the creek for a while. Some of the prettiest country around here, and the ground's level enough that the horses won't have to work too hard. As they rode side by side through the golden prairie grass, Penelope found herself captivated by the landscape. Coming from the crowded streets of Philadelphia, the vastness of the Dakota Territory was both intimidating and exhilarating. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees that marked the meandering path of the creek. In the distance, the dark silhouette of the Black Hills rose against the sky. It's breathtaking, she said, drawing her horse to a stop atop a small rise that offered a panoramic view. I've never seen anything like it. Ethan nodded, his expression softening as he gazed out at his adopted homeland. First time I saw this country, I knew I'd never want to leave. There's a freedom here you can't find back east. I can understand why, Penelope replied softly. It makes a person feel small and significant all at once. He looked at her with surprise and approval. That's exactly it. Most folks only see the harshness, the isolation. They miss the beauty. The harshness is part of the beauty, isn't it? She observed. Like the way winter makes you appreciate spring all the more. For a long moment, Ethan simply looked at her, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Then he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his features and made Penelope's heart flutter unexpectedly. You might do all right out here after all, Penelope Watson. They continued their ride, Ethan pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. He showed her where a family of beavers had built a dam across the creek, creating a small pond that attracted all manner of wildlife. Later, they dismounted to rest the horses and eat the simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried fruit that Ethan had packed in his saddlebags. Sitting beside the creek, listening to the water's gentle burbling and watching clouds drift lazily overhead, Penelope felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her father's illness. Here, hundreds of miles from everything familiar, she'd found a moment of perfect contentment. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Penelope smiled at the childhood expression. "I was just thinking how strange life's paths can be. A week ago, I never could have imagined sitting here like this, yet now I can't imagine being anywhere else at this moment." Ethan's eyes met hers, and the intensity she saw there made her breath catch. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. "Yes," she agreed softly, "it does." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. For a heartbeat, Penelope thought Ethan might lean forward, might close the small distance between them. Her pulse quickened at the thought, but the moment passed when a fish jumped in the creek, breaking the spell. Ethan cleared his throat and began gathering the remains of their lunch. "We should head back. Don't want to overdo it on your first day back in the saddle." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Yet it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, rather. It felt like the pause between movements in a symphony, a necessary interlude before the music continued. That evening, after a simple supper, they sat again before the fireplace. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, drumming softly on the cabin's roof and hissing in the chimney. "Will you tell me more about the war?" Penelope asked quietly, sensing that Ethan's experiences there were central to understanding the man he'd become. He was silent for so long that she thought he might refuse, and she wouldn't have blamed him. But finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I was 19 when I enlisted. Thought I was a man already, but I hadn't seen anything yet. First real battle was Shiloh, after that." He shook his head. "Nothing prepares you for it. The noise, the chaos, the smells. Men you'd played cards with the night before, dead beside you by noon." Penelope listened without interruption, as Ethan spoke of the years that had shaped him, the long marches, the hunger and cold, the brief respites of camaraderie around campfires. He spoke of his brother Samuel's death at Gettysburg, how he hadn't learned of it until weeks later. Of being wounded at Cold Harbor and nearly dying of infection afterward. "When it was over, I couldn't go home," he said finally. "Too many ghosts in Missouri, too many memories. Worked my way west instead, took whatever jobs I could find. Ranch hand, cattle drive, even mined for a spell, though I knew I'd never make my fortune that way." He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Saved every penny until I could claim my own land, build something that was mine alone." "You've done that," Penelope said softly. "What you've created here, it's remarkable, Ethan." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's a living. But lately I've been thinking it could be more." His gaze met hers, and there was a vulnerability there that tugged at her heart. "A home needs more than just walls and a roof." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Penelope felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Yes," she agreed softly, "it does." Later, as she prepared for bed, Penelope found herself standing at the window, watching the rain silver the darkness. Tomorrow they would ride to Custer, and she would begin the life she had planned for herself. A respectable position, independence, a fresh start. Yet now, the thought of leaving this cabin, of leaving Ethan, filled her with an unexpected melancholy. In just 3 days, he had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Was she being foolish? They barely knew each other. She had commitments to fulfill, a contract signed. And Ethan? Well, he'd been kind, certainly, but that didn't mean his interest extended beyond neighborly concern for a woman in distress. Still, as she climbed into bed for her last night beneath Ethan's roof, Penelope couldn't help but wonder what might have been if circumstances were different. And as sleep claimed her, her dreams were filled with hazel eyes and the vast Dakota sky. Saturday dawned clear after the night's rain, the world washed clean and gleaming with dew. Ethan and Penelope prepared for the journey to Custer in a strange mood, both eager and reluctant, their conversation punctuated by long silences filled with things unsaid. They set out mid-morning, Penelope riding her borrowed mare which had indeed recovered its strength. Ethan had packed provisions for the journey, though he assured her they would reach town well before nightfall. "The school is on the north end of Main Street," he told her as they rode. "Can't miss it, white clapboard building with a bell tower. The schoolmaster's quarters are attached at the back." "Small but comfortable, from what I've heard." Penelope nodded, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the ache in her chest. "And the general store. I'll need to replace everything I lost in the robbery. Olson's Mercantile has most anything you'd need. Owner's a fair man, won't gouge you on prices." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I'd be happy to help you get settled, introduce you around town." "That's very kind," Penelope replied, warmth spreading through her at his offer. "I'd appreciate that." The journey to Custer passed more quickly than Penelope would have liked. As they crested a hill in the early afternoon, the town spread before them in the valley below, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a wide main street, with smaller structures radiating outward. It wasn't large by Eastern standards, perhaps 40 or 50 buildings in all, but it had an air of permanence about it that many frontier towns lacked. "There it is," Ethan said, drawing his horse to a stop beside her. "Custer, population 300 and growing." Penelope studied the town that was to be her new home, trying to summon the excitement she'd felt when she'd accepted the teaching position. It was a respectable place, certainly, with a proper church spire rising near the center and what appeared to be several substantial businesses along the main thoroughfare. Yet all she could think was how far it would be from Ethan's ranch. 15 miles might as well have been 1,000 when one considered the practicalities of frontier life. "It looks lovely," she said, her voice not quite steady. Ethan glanced at her, concern furrowing his brow. "Are you all right? We can rest here a bit longer if you need." "No, I'm fine," she assured him, straightening her shoulders. "Just a bit nervous about meeting everyone, I suppose." He nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Natural enough." "But they'll be lucky to have you, Penelope." The warmth in his voice gave her courage. Together they urged their horses forward, descending the gentle slope toward the town. Custer was bustling with Saturday activity when they rode down Main Street. Wagons and riders moved up and down the dusty thoroughfare, while townspeople went about their business on the wooden sidewalks. A few curious glances came their way. Newcomers were always a source of interest in small communities, but most people offered friendly nods of greeting. Ethan led her to a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Dakota Hotel, explaining that she should have a proper place to stay until she could move into the schoolmaster's quarters. "School board won't expect you until Monday," he said as he helped her dismount. "Gives you time to get your bearings and acquire what you need." Inside, the hotel was simple but clean, with a small lobby furnished with several chairs and a desk where a motherly-looking woman greeted them warmly. "Ethan Hayes, as I live and breathe," she exclaimed. "Twice in 1 month. The town must be growing on you." Ethan smiled, removing his hat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thornton. This is Miss Penelope Watson, the new schoolteacher. She's had a bit of trouble on her journey and needs a room for a few days until she can move into the school quarters. Mrs. Thornton's face lit with interest as she turned to Penelope. "Oh, we've been so looking forward to your arrival, Miss Watson. The children have been running wild without proper schooling these past months." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Penelope replied. "I'm looking forward to beginning my duties." "You poor dear, you do look like you've had a hard journey," Mrs. Thornton said, her keen eyes noting Penelope's travel-worn appearance. "We'll get you settled right away. Best room in the house for our new teacher." After signing the guest register, Penelope found herself being whisked upstairs to a pleasant corner room overlooking the main street. Mrs. Thornton promised to send up hot water for washing and inquired about her luggage. "I'm afraid my belongings were lost in a stagecoach robbery," Penelope explained, embarrassed by her circumstances. "I'll need to purchase new things before classes begin." Mrs. Thornton's expression turned sympathetic. "Dreadful business, those highway robberies." "Well, Olson's Mercantile can provide most necessities, and for anything more particular, Sarah Jenkins does fine sewing. She could have a new dress ready for you by Monday if you visit her this afternoon." Once Mrs. Thornton had departed, promising tea sent up shortly, Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. Everything was happening so quickly now, the peaceful days at Ethan's ranch already beginning to feel like a dream. A soft knock at the door roused her. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, hat in hand. "Thought I'd see if you wanted company to visit the Mercantile," he offered. "And I should introduce you to Mr. Collins, head of the school board. His office is just down the street." Penelope smiled, genuinely grateful for his continued support. "Yes, please, just give me a moment to freshen up." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions and preparations. Mr. Collins, a portly man with impressive whiskers and a booming voice, was delighted to meet his new teacher and assured her that everything was in readiness at the school. He provided a key to the schoolhouse and teachers' quarters, suggesting she might want to inspect them before Monday. At Olson's Mercantile, Ethan stood patiently while Penelope selected the basic necessities she would need: undergarments, stockings, a nightgown, toiletries, and writing materials. When she protested at his insistence on carrying her packages, he simply raised an eyebrow and reminded her that she was still recovering her strength. Sarah Jenkins, the seamstress, proved to be a godsend. A practical woman in her 40s with clever fingers and a good eye, she had Penelope measured and fitted for 2 new dresses in record time, promising delivery of one by Sunday evening and the other within the week. "A school teacher needs to look the part," she declared, selecting a sensible navy blue wool for one dress and a warm brown for the other. "These will wear well and present a proper appearance." By late afternoon, Penelope's head was spinning with new names and faces. The town doctor had stopped by the hotel to introduce himself, as had the minister and his wife. Word of the new teacher's arrival had spread quickly, and it seemed everyone wanted to welcome her to Custer. Through it all, Ethan remained at her side, a steady presence that anchored her amidst the flood of new experiences. His quiet support meant more to her than she could express, and she found herself dreading the moment when he would have to return to his ranch. That moment came sooner than she would have liked. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they stood outside the hotel after having inspected the schoolhouse and teachers' quarters. "I should head back while there's still light," Ethan said, his expression reluctant. "Got animals to tend to." "Of course," Penelope replied, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "You've already done so much. I can't thank you enough, Ethan." He shook his head. "No need for thanks, I told you that." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Penelope wished desperately that she could find the courage to say what was in her heart, that these few days had changed her, that she didn't want this to be goodbye. Perhaps you could come to town again soon," she ventured. "I'd like to know how you're getting on." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, hope perhaps, or relief. "I'd like that. Might have business in town next week, in fact." "Good," Penelope said, smiling despite the ache in her chest. "I'll look forward to it." Ethan hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. His touch was warm and gentle, his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller hand. "Take care of yourself, Penelope Watson. And you, Ethan Hayes." For a moment she thought he might say more, might do more. But then he released her hand, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell, and turned toward where his horse was hitched outside the mercantile. Penelope watched him mount up, her heart in her throat. As he turned his horse toward the edge of town, he looked back once, raising his hand in a final farewell. She returned the gesture, standing on the hotel porch until he was out of sight, a solitary figure riding into the golden light of the setting sun. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. In the span of 3 days, she had fallen in love with Ethan Hayes. The first week of school passed in a blur of activity that left Penelope little time for melancholy. 27 students ranging in age from 6 to 16 filled the schoolhouse, bringing with them a mixture of excitement, wariness, and in some cases, outright skepticism about their new teacher. The older boys, particularly, seemed determined to test her mettle in those early days. But Penelope had not survived teaching at the Philadelphia seminary without developing strategies for maintaining order, and by Wednesday, even the most recalcitrant students had begrudgingly accepted her authority. The teacher's quarters, though small, proved comfortable enough. A sitting room with a small stove served as both kitchen and living area, while a separate bedroom provided private space. It was sparsely furnished, but with her first month's salary advance, Penelope was able to purchase a few items to make it more home-like: curtains for the windows, a colorful quilt for the bed, and a small bookshelf for the few volumes she'd acquired to replace her lost library. The townspeople were welcoming, if curious about the Eastern woman who had come to teach their children. Sunday church service provided an opportunity to meet most of the community at once, and invitations to supper began arriving almost immediately. Penelope accepted them gratefully, recognizing the importance of building relationships in her new home. Yet despite the busyness and the genuine warmth of her reception, Penelope found her thoughts returning constantly to Ethan and the peaceful days at his ranch. Each evening, as she sat alone in her quarters marking students' work or preparing lessons, she wondered what he was doing at that moment, if he was sitting before his fire with a cup of coffee, perhaps thinking of her as well. By Friday, she had almost convinced herself that their connection had been one-sided, a product of unusual circumstances and her own vulnerable state. Ethan had been kind, certainly, but kindness didn't equate to deeper feelings. Perhaps he had already forgotten the woman who had fainted at his door, now that his duty to her was fulfilled. Saturday morning found Penelope at the mercantile, selecting supplies for the coming week's lessons. She was examining a set of chalk when the bell above the door jingled, and a familiar voice addressed Mr. Olson at the counter. "Morning. Got that order of seed I asked about last week?" Penelope's heart leaped at the sound of Ethan's voice. She turned slowly, chalk still clutched in her hand, to find him standing just inside the doorway, his broad-shouldered figure silhouetted against the morning light. For a moment, he didn't notice her, his attention on the storekeeper. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned, his hazel eyes widening slightly when they found her among the shelves. "Miss Watson," he said, removing his hat. "Good morning." The formality of his greeting stung a little, but Penelope reminded herself they were in public now, not alone at his ranch. "Mr. Hayes, how nice to see you again." Mr. Olson glanced between them with interest. "You two acquainted already?" "Mr. Hayes kindly assisted me when I encountered difficulties on my journey to Custer," Penelope explained, keeping her tone carefully neutral despite the rapid beating of her heart. That's so. Olson raised his eyebrows. Well, Ethan's a good man to have around in a pinch. Let me get that seed for you from the back room. As Olson disappeared through a door behind the counter, an awkward silence fell between them. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hat held between his hands. "How are you settling in?" he asked finally. "School going well?" "Very well, thank you," Penelope replied, wishing desperately they were not having this stilted conversation in the middle of the mercantile. "The children are bright and eager to learn for the most part." "Good, that's good." Ethan cleared his throat. "And your quarters, comfortable?" "Quite adequate, yes." Another silence fell, more uncomfortable than the first. Penelope searched for anything to say that might break through the strange formality that had sprung up between them. "I was just about to have lunch at the hotel dining room," she said impulsively. "Perhaps, if you're not too busy with your errands, you might join me." Relief flooded Ethan's face. "I'd like that, very much." When Mr. Olson returned with the seed, Ethan completed his purchase quickly. Then, after Penelope had paid for her chalk, they walked together toward the hotel, their earlier awkwardness gradually giving way to more comfortable conversation. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this hour, and they were shown to a quiet table near the window. As they settled in, Penelope found herself studying Ethan's face, noting the new lines of fatigue around his eyes. "You look tired," she said softly. "Have you been working too hard?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No harder than usual, just haven't been sleeping well." Something in his tone made her wonder if his sleepless nights might have the same cause as her own, but she didn't dare ask directly. Instead, she told him about her first week of teaching, the challenges and small triumphs, the personalities of her students, her plans for the curriculum. Ethan listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a genuine interest in her work. When their food arrived, hearty beef stew with fresh bread, they continued talking, the conversation flowing as easily as it had during those evenings by his fireplace. "The ranch seems quiet without you there," Ethan said suddenly as they were finishing their meal. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her, and a flush rose to his weathered cheeks. "I mean, it's always been quiet, but now it seems empty," Penelope suggested, her heart hammering in her chest. He met her eyes, his own filled with an emotion she hadn't dared hope to see. "Yes, empty." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Penelope took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've missed our conversations," she admitted. "The evenings by the fire." "Have you?" His voice was low, uncertain in a way that touched her deeply. "Very much." Penelope hesitated, then added, "I've missed you, Ethan." The naked hope that flared in his eyes made her breath catch. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the busy dining room fading away until it felt as though they were alone in the world. "Penelope," Ethan began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we haven't known each other long, but Miss Watson," a cheerful voice interrupted. "What a pleasure to see you here." Penelope turned, struggling to hide her frustration as Mr. Collins approached their table, beaming broadly. The school board president seemed oblivious to the moment he had shattered as he launched into a detailed discussion of the upcoming school term. By the time they extricated themselves from the conversation, the intimate mood had been broken. Outside the hotel, Ethan glanced up at the position of the sun. "I should finish my errands if I want to make it home before dark," he said reluctantly. Penelope nodded, disappointed but understanding the practicalities of ranch life. Of course, an idea struck her suddenly. "The school is hosting a harvest social next Friday evening. The whole town will be there. Would you consider attending?" Hope brightened Ethan's face. "I'd be honored, though I should warn you I'm not much for dancing." "Neither am I," Penelope admitted with a smile, "but I'd very much like to see you there." "Then you will," he promised. This time, when they parted, the farewell felt different, not an ending, but a pause before the next movement in a melody they were creating together. The week leading up to the harvest social was the longest of Penelope's life. Though she threw herself into her teaching duties with enthusiasm, her thoughts continually drifted to Friday evening and the prospect of seeing Ethan again. She found herself paying special attention to her appearance that morning, wearing her new brown dress, the nicer of the two Sarah Jenkins had made for her, and arranging her hair with extra care. The older students exchanged knowing glances when they saw her, whispering behind their hands, but Penelope pretended not to notice. The social was to be held in the schoolhouse itself, with the desks pushed to the walls and benches brought in for seating. Throughout the day, mothers arrived with baskets of food for the evening's festivities, while fathers and older boys strung paper lanterns across the ceiling. By late afternoon, when she dismissed the students early to prepare for the event, the schoolroom had been transformed. Autumn leaves and dried corn husks decorated the walls, and mouth-watering aromas from the food table filled the air. A small area had been cleared for dancing, where 3 local musicians would provide entertainment with fiddle, banjo, and accordion. Penelope hurried to her quarters to freshen up before the guests began arriving. She changed into her navy blue dress, more suitable for an evening occasion, and pinched color into her cheeks. Her reflection in the small mirror revealed a woman she hardly recognized, eyes bright with anticipation, cheeks flushed, a nervous smile playing about her lips. By 7 o'clock, the schoolhouse was filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and music. Nearly everyone in Custer had turned out for the social, from the youngest infants to the oldest grandparents. Penelope moved among them, greeting parents and students, accepting compliments on the school's progress and the success of the social. But all the while, her eyes kept straying to the door, watching for Ethan's arrival. 8 o'clock came, then 8:30. The dancing had begun in earnest, couples twirling around the small space while children darted between them, playing their own games. Still, there was no sign of Ethan. By 9, Penelope had begun to lose hope. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps the connection she thought they shared had been imagined after all. Or worse, maybe something had happened to him on the journey to town. She was considering slipping away to her quarters for a moment of privacy when the door opened one more time, and Ethan stepped into the crowded schoolroom. He had clearly made an effort for the occasion. His usual work clothes had been replaced by clean dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd shaved his usual stubble. But what caught Penelope's attention most was the small bouquet of late wildflowers he held awkwardly in one hand. Their eyes met across the room, and everything else, the noise, the crowd, the music, seemed to fade away. Ethan made his way toward her, nodding politely to those who greeted him but never breaking his gaze from hers. "I apologize for being late," he said when he reached her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Had a fence to mend before I could leave." "You're here now," Penelope replied, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "That's what matters." Ethan held out the wildflowers, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans, tied with a simple string. "These were the best I could find this late in the season. Not much, I'm afraid." Penelope accepted them, touched beyond measure by the simple gesture. "They're beautiful, thank you." A slightly awkward silence fell between them, both suddenly aware of the curious glances being cast their way. Ethan cleared his throat. "Would you? That is, I know I said I'm not much for dancing, but if you'd be willing." "I'd love to," Penelope said. saving him from having to finish the difficult request. She placed the flowers carefully on a nearby table, then allowed Ethan to lead her to the makeshift dance floor. The musicians had just begun a waltz, slower and more manageable than the lively reels that had preceded it. Ethan's hand was warm at her waist, his other gently holding hers as they began to move to the music. He had been modest about his dancing abilities while not flashy. He moved with the same quiet confidence he showed in all physical tasks. "You dance very well for someone who claims not to be much for it," Penelope observed, smiling up at him. A hint of color touched his cheeks. "My mother insisted I learn the basics, said no son of hers would be entirely uncivilized even on the frontier. She was a wise woman." "She was," Ethan agreed, his expression softening at the memory. Then his eyes focused fully on Penelope again. "You look beautiful tonight." Now it was Penelope's turn to blush. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." They continued to dance, gradually moving closer until there was barely space for propriety between them. Penelope was acutely aware of every point where they touched his hand at her waist. Their palms pressed together, occasionally the brush of his chest against hers when the dance brought them closer. When the music ended, neither moved immediately to separate. They stood still amid the swirl of other couples, gazing at each other as if trying to memorize every detail. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" Ethan asked, his voice husky. "It's getting rather warm in here." Penelope nodded, understanding that he was offering a moment of privacy away from the curious eyes of the townspeople. She led the way to the side door that opened onto the schoolyard, where several benches had been placed for those needing respite from the festivities. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, stars blazing overhead in a cloudless sky. A nearly full moon bathed the yard in silver light, making the scene almost magical in its beauty. They settled on a bench beneath a cottonwood tree, far enough from the schoolhouse to speak privately, but still within sight of the lighted windows, maintaining propriety while allowing for honesty. "I've been thinking about you all week," Ethan admitted, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Trying to find the right words for what I want to say." Penelope's heart fluttered in her chest. "And have you found them?" He turned to look at her then, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Not entirely. Words aren't my strong suit, as you've probably noticed." "I think you express yourself very well," Penelope said softly. Ethan smiled slightly. "That's kind of you to say." He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "The truth is, Penelope, these past weeks since you came into my life have been different, better. When you're not there, the ranch feels emptier than it ever did before." Hope bloomed in Penelope's chest, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to finish what he'd started. "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, "and I know you have your teaching position, your plans. I wouldn't ask you to give those up, but I was wondering if you might consider visiting the ranch sometimes, perhaps on weekends when school doesn't keep you busy." The hesitant invitation touched Penelope deeply. It was so like Ethan to offer what he thought she could accept without sacrificing her independence, rather than asking for what he truly wanted. "Is that all you want, Ethan? Occasional visits?" His eyes met hers, startled by her directness. For a long moment he said nothing, and Penelope feared she had been too bold, had misread his intentions entirely. Then slowly he shook his head. "No," he admitted. "It's not all I want." "What do you want?" she pressed gently. Ethan swallowed hard. "I want you to be there every evening when I come in from work. I want to see your smile across the table at breakfast. I want to build a life with you, Penelope Watson, if you'd consider such a thing with a man like me." Joy surged through Penelope, so intense it nearly took her breath away. "A man like you? You mean a kind, honorable, gentle man who took in a stranger and cared for her without asking anything in return, who makes me feel safer and more cherished than anyone ever has." She reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Yes, Ethan Hayes. I would consider such a thing. In fact, I've thought of little else since I left your ranch." The hope that blazed in his eyes made her heart swell. "You have." "I have," she confirmed. "I know it's fast, impossibly fast by the standards I was raised with, but out here everything is different. Life is more immediate, more real somehow. And what I feel for you is very real, Ethan." He caught her hand in his, pressing it to his lips in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you, Penelope. I think I've loved you since I carried you to my bed and prayed you'd be all right." "I love you too," she whispered, the words flowing easily now that they had been set free. "I think I knew it that first evening by your fire, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself." Ethan's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she were made of the finest porcelain. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss so sweet it made her heart ache. It was a tender kiss, respectful but filled with promise. When they finally drew apart, Penelope felt as though something fundamental had shifted inside her, as if she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. "What about your teaching position?" Ethan asked, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone. "I wouldn't ask you to give up something that means so much to you." Penelope considered this. "The school term runs until May. I've signed a contract and I wouldn't want to leave the children without a teacher." She smiled, an idea forming. "But afterward?" "Well, there's no reason I couldn't teach at a school closer to the ranch, or even tutor neighboring children if no formal position is available." "You'd be willing to do that, to change your plans for me." "Not for you," Penelope corrected gently. "For us, for the life we could build together." Ethan smiled, the expression transforming his face with a joy she'd never seen there before. "I like the sound of that. Us." From the schoolhouse, the music had changed to a livelier tune, the sounds of laughter and stomping feet drifting out into the night. But Penelope and Ethan remained on their bench beneath the cottonwood tree, planning a future neither had imagined possible just weeks before. "I should court you properly," Ethan said as the evening grew later. "Call on you at your quarters, take you for Sunday drives, bring you flowers that aren't half wilted from the ride to town." Penelope laughed softly. "I loved those flowers precisely because you brought them all that way." She squeezed his hand. "But yes, courting sounds lovely. And it will give us time to be certain of our feelings before making any formal announcements." "I'm already certain," Ethan said, his voice firm with conviction. "But I understand the wisdom in proceeding carefully. Your reputation in town is important for your position." The consideration in his words touched her deeply. This was a man who thought of her needs alongside his own, a rarity in Penelope's experience. As the social began to wind down, they reluctantly returned inside. Ethan stayed by her side as they bid farewell to departing families, his presence beside her feeling natural and right, despite the curious glances and knowing smiles their closeness provoked. When the last guests had gone and only the cleanup remained, Ethan insisted on helping. Together, they restored the schoolroom to order, working in companionable silence broken occasionally by shared smiles and brief touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing a stack of books. Finally, standing in the empty schoolroom, Ethan took both her hands in his. "I've taken rooms at the hotel for tonight. Will you join me for breakfast tomorrow before I head back to the ranch?" "I'd like that very much," Penelope replied. 8 o'clock, he nodded, then bent to kiss her once more, a brief, sweet contact that nonetheless left her breathless. "Good night, Penelope. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Ethan." After he left, Penelope moved through her quarters in a happy daze, preparing for bed with a smile that wouldn't fade. As she lay beneath her quilt, staring at the moonlight filtering through her window, she marveled at the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come west seeking a fresh start, a place to rebuild her life after loss. Never had she imagined finding love in the process, certainly not with a quiet rancher who had carried her to safety when she fainted at his door. Yet somehow, it felt right, as if all the hardships and losses that had brought her to this point had been leading her to Ethan all along. With that comforting thought, Penelope drifted to sleep, her dreams filled with hazel eyes and the promise of tomorrow. Throughout the autumn months, Ethan courted Penelope with a dedication that touched her deeply. Every Saturday, without fail, he made the 15-mile journey to Custer, arriving in time to take her to lunch at the hotel dining room. They would spend the afternoon together, sometimes walking along the creek that ran behind the town, other times attending community gatherings, or simply sitting in her small parlor talking for hours. Each visit, he brought her some small gift wildflowers until the frost claimed them, then bundles of colorful leaves, interesting rocks he'd found on his property, once a beautiful quill pen he'd carved himself from a wild turkey feather. These tokens, valuable only for the thought behind them, became Penelope's most cherished possessions. On Sundays, Ethan would escort her to church, sitting beside her in the pew with a quiet pride that spoke volumes to the observant townsfolk. Afterward, if weather permitted, they would take a drive in the buggy he borrowed from the livery stable, exploring the countryside around Custer. During the week, when ranch work and teaching duties kept them apart, Ethan would sometimes send notes with travelers heading to town, brief messages that revealed a poetic soul beneath his practical exterior. "The sunrise reminded me of your smile this morning," one read. Another simply stated, "The cabin feels emptier with each passing day." As October gave way to November and the first snow dusted the Black Hills, their courtship deepened. The town had long since accepted them as a couple, with most people expressing approval of the match. Ethan Hayes was well respected in the community, and many had worried about the solitary life he led. Seeing him smile more frequently, engage more readily in conversation at the mercantile or the barber shop, the townspeople concluded that the Eastern schoolteacher had been good for him. For her part, Penelope flourished in her role at the school. Her students responded well to her firm but kind teaching style, and parents commented favorably on their children's progress. Yet everyone noticed how her face lit up when Ethan entered a room, how she seemed to glow from within whenever he was near. By early December, as Christmas approached, they had begun making plans for the future. Ethan had started construction on an addition to his cabin, 2 new rooms that would provide more space for a family. The implication wasn't lost on Penelope, though neither had spoken directly of marriage yet. That changed on a crisp Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas. Ethan had arrived in town earlier than usual, meeting Penelope as she dismissed her students for the weekend. His expression was more serious than usual, a nervousness about him that she hadn't seen before. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they walked toward her quarters. "You seem preoccupied." "Just thinking," he replied, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Actually, I was hoping we might ride out to the ranch today if you're willing. There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Penelope agreed readily. Within the hour, they were on horseback heading out of town, Ethan leading the way along the familiar trail. The day was cold but clear, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. As they neared the ranch, Penelope noticed smoke rising from the cabin chimney. "Is someone there?" she asked, surprised. Ethan nodded. "Asked my neighbor Tom Miller to start a fire before we arrived. Didn't want you coming into a cold house." The thoughtfulness of the gesture warmed Penelope more than any fire could have. As they approached the cabin, however, she noticed other changes as well. The addition Ethan had mentioned was further along than she'd expected, the outer walls completely framed and partially sided. But what caught her eye most was a small fenced area near the cabin, a garden plot, she realized, with neat rows marked out despite the winter snow covering the ground. "You've been busy," she commented as they dismounted in front of the cabin. Ethan helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Wanted everything to be ready." "Ready for what?" Penelope asked, her heart beginning to beat faster at the intensity in his gaze. "For what I hope will be your answer," he replied mysteriously. "Come inside. It's too cold to talk out here." The cabin was wonderfully warm after the chilly ride, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth. But what made Penelope gasp was the transformation of the interior. Gone was the Spartan bachelor quarters she remembered. In its place was a home. Curtains hung at the windows, simple gingham, but freshly pressed and cheerful. The rough wooden table was covered with a proper cloth, set with matching plates and cups. A rocking chair sat beside the fireplace, with a colorful quilt draped over its back. And on every surface were small touches that spoke of care and consideration: a vase ready for flowers, a shelf of books, even a small piano in the corner. "Ethan," she breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "What is all this?" He stood in the center of the room, watching her reaction with nervous anticipation. "Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "But I don't understand. When did you do all this?" "Been working on it a little at a time," he admitted. "Ordered the piano from Denver 2 months ago. It arrived last week." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as a sign of nervousness. "I wanted everything to be perfect when I asked." He trailed off, then seemed to gather his courage. Taking her hands in his, Ethan led Penelope to the rocking chair, gesturing for her to sit while he knelt before her. "Penelope Watson," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you came into my life, I thought I knew what happiness was. I had my land, my animals, my independence. I told myself it was enough." He shook his head. "I was wrong, so wrong." Tears began to well in Penelope's eyes as she realized what was happening. "These past months with you have shown me what true happiness can be," Ethan continued. "You've brought laughter and warmth into my life when I didn't even realize they were missing. You've made me dream of a future I never thought I deserved." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, clearly new, clearly purchased for this moment. Opening it, he revealed a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "I love you, Penelope. With all that I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Joy surged through Penelope, so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice failing her momentarily. Then stronger. "Yes, Ethan. Yes, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face was radiant, all traces of nervousness vanishing in an instant. With slightly trembling hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, pulling her up with him into an embrace that expressed everything words could not. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at once, Ethan gestured around the cabin. "I wanted you to see what our home could be like. I know it's not as grand as what you might have had in Philadelphia. It's perfect," Penelope interrupted, touching his face gently. "More perfect than anything I could have imagined, because it's ours." His eyes, bright with unshed tears, searched hers. You're sure life out here won't always be easy. Winters are harsh and the nearest neighbors are miles away. It's a far cry from city life. I've never been more certain of anything, she assured him. This is where I belong, Ethan, with you. Later, as they sat before the fire sharing the simple meal Ethan had prepared for the occasion, they began to plan their future in earnest. The school term ends in May, Penelope said, admiring how her ring caught the firelight. I could fulfill my contract and we could marry in June. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. That gives us time to finish the addition properly and to prepare for whatever comes next. The implication in his words brought a flush to Penelope's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. I would very much like a family with you, Ethan. Children to fill this house with noise and laughter. I'd like that too, he said softly. More than I can say. As twilight deepened outside, Penelope knew they should start back to town soon to avoid raising eyebrows about propriety. Yet she was reluctant to leave this perfect moment, this glimpse of the life they would share. We should go, she sighed, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. Ethan followed her gaze, then made a decision. It's getting too dark to travel safely. We should stay here tonight. Penelope's eyes widened at the suggestion. But what will people say? They'll say a snowstorm threatened, and the schoolteacher and her fiancé sensibly took shelter at his ranch rather than risking the journey back to town. Ethan replied, a mischievous glint in his eye as he nodded toward the window. Following his gaze, Penelope saw that snow had indeed begun to fall, not heavily yet, but steadily increasing. Whether by luck or divine intervention, nature had provided them with a perfectly reasonable excuse to extend their time together. Besides, Ethan added more seriously, we're engaged now. That changes things. Penelope couldn't argue with his logic, nor did she particularly want to. The prospect of a night in the cabin, their future home, was too appealing to resist. Very well, she agreed, trying to sound practical despite the flutter of excitement in her stomach. We'll stay. But you'll take the bunkhouse and I'll sleep here. Ethan's smile told her he'd expected nothing less. Of course, I'd never compromise your reputation, Penelope, not even now. As they settled in for the evening, adding more logs to the fire and lighting the lamps against the growing darkness outside, Penelope felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This cabin, this land, this man, they were her future. A future brighter and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she left Philadelphia. When she finally bid Ethan good night, accepting one long, sweet kiss before he retreated to the bunkhouse, Penelope stood in the doorway watching his figure disappear into the snowy darkness. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, a tangible symbol of promises made and a future secured. 6 months, she thought as she closed the door against the cold. 6 months until this would be her home permanently. Until she would be Penelope Hayes, wife and partner to the man she loved beyond reason. It seemed both an eternity and no time at all. The months between their engagement and wedding day passed in a whirl of preparations and anticipation. News of their engagement spread quickly through Custer, met with general approval and no small amount of satisfaction from those who had watched their courtship unfold. Winter settled heavily over Dakota Territory, bringing blizzards that sometimes kept Ethan from making his weekly journey to town. During these separations, Penelope threw herself into her teaching duties and wedding preparations, corresponding with her few remaining contacts in Philadelphia to arrange for certain items she couldn't acquire locally. Spring arrived late but gloriously, the prairie exploding with wildflowers as the snow retreated. Each weekend, Ethan would take Penelope to the ranch to see the progress on the addition. By April, It was complete, 2 new rooms added to the original cabin. One a proper bedroom with space for a large bed and dressing table. The other a small study where Penelope could continue her intellectual pursuits and perhaps tutor students in the future. In town, preparations for the wedding took shape. The ceremony would be held in the church, followed by a celebration at the schoolhouse, the largest building in Custer capable of hosting the entire community, which had universally decided to attend whether formally invited or not. Sarah Jenkins created a wedding dress that brought tears to Penelope's eyes when she first tried it on ivory silk ordered specially from Chicago, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was simpler than what she might have worn in Philadelphia, but all the more beautiful for its understated elegance. As the school term drew to a close, Penelope found herself increasingly impatient for June to arrive. Her students, sensing her distraction, teased her gently about her sweetheart, a term that never failed to bring color to her cheeks despite her attempts at maintaining a dignified demeanor. Finally, the last day of school arrived. As Penelope dismissed her students for the summer, accepting hugs and small gifts with genuine emotion, she realized how deeply attached she had grown to the children of Custer. Though she wouldn't be their teacher in the fall, she promised to visit often and perhaps organize special reading circles or music lessons if there was interest. The school board had already hired her replacement, a young woman from Minnesota, who would arrive in August to prepare for the new term. Mr. Collins assured Penelope that while the new teacher came highly recommended, she would have very large shoes to fill. "You've set a high standard, Miss Watson," he told her during their final meeting. "The children have flourished under your guidance." "Thank you," Penelope replied, touched by his praise. "I've enjoyed every moment with them." "And will we see you in town regularly after the wedding?" he inquired. 15 miles isn't such a great distance." "Absolutely," she assured him. "Ethan has promised to bring me in for church services whenever weather permits and for any special community events. And of course, we'll need supplies regularly." Collins nodded, satisfied. "Good, good. Wouldn't want to lose you entirely to ranch life. And I suspect once word gets out about your tutoring abilities, you'll have neighboring families bringing their children to you for extra learning." The prospect pleased Penelope. While she was eager to begin her new life as Ethan's wife, the thought of abandoning teaching entirely had been somewhat melancholy. The possibility of continuing to educate children, even on a smaller scale, eased that particular concern. As June arrived, bringing consistently warm weather and the final wedding preparations, Penelope moved her belongings from the teacher's quarters to the hotel. The new teacher would need the space when she arrived, and Penelope had accumulated more possessions than she'd realized during her months in Custer. The week before the wedding was a flurry of activity. Ethan stayed in town to help with final arrangements, taking a room at the hotel as well, though propriety dictated they maintain separate accommodations until after the ceremony. Each evening, they would walk together through town, discussing last-minute details and simply enjoying each other's company as the big day approached. On the eve of their wedding, after a rehearsal at the church followed by a dinner hosted by Mr. and Mrs. Collins, Ethan walked Penelope back to the hotel. The night was warm, stars brilliant overhead, the scent of prairie flowers filling the air. "Nervous?" Ethan asked as they strolled arm in arm along the quiet main street. Penelope considered the question. "Not about marrying you," she answered honestly. "That feels like the most natural thing in the world, but about the ceremony itself with everyone watching, perhaps a little." Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just look at me. Pretend it's just the two of us." She smiled up at him, heart full of love for this man who always seemed to know exactly what she needed. "That's excellent advice, Mr. Hayes." They paused outside the hotel, reluctant as always to part for the night. Tomorrow at this time, they would be husband and wife, no longer saying goodnight at a hotel door but retiring together to the bridal suite that had been prepared for them. "This time tomorrow," Ethan said, as if reading her thoughts, "you'll be Mrs. Hayes." "Yes," Penelope replied softly. "And you'll be stuck with me for the rest of your days." He laughed, pulling her close for a brief but fervent kiss. "Nothing I want more in this world." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of their union. Penelope woke early, too excited to sleep any longer, and stood at her window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Mrs. Thornton arrived soon after, along with Sarah Jenkins and several other women from town who had appointed themselves Penelope's attendants for the day. They brought breakfast, which Penelope barely touched, and helped her prepare for the ceremony. As the church bells rang 10 o'clock, Penelope stood in a small anteroom, dressed in her wedding finery. Her hair had been arranged in an elegant updo, adorned with small white flowers. The ivory silk of her dress caught the light streaming through the windows, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Thornton said, adjusting the simple veil. "Ethan Hayes won't know what hit him." Penelope smiled, her heart too full for words. This was it, the beginning of her new life. A life she hadn't even dared dream of when she'd set out for Dakota Territory nearly a year ago. A knock at the door announced that it was time. Mr. Collins, who had offered to escort Penelope down the aisle in the absence of her father, entered the room and stopped short at the sight of her. "My word," he said, clearly moved. "You are a vision, Miss Watson." "Thank you," Penelope replied, accepting his arm. "Shall we?" The church was filled to capacity, every resident of Custer and many from the surrounding countryside having turned out for the occasion. As the doors opened and the small organ began to play, Penelope took a deep breath and focused on the figure waiting for her at the altar. Ethan stood tall and proud in a new suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to awe as he caught sight of his bride. The love in his eyes was so apparent, so unconcealed, that Penelope felt tears of joy spring to her own. Following Ethan's advice, she kept her gaze fixed on him as she walked down the aisle, barely aware of the smiling faces watching her progress. All that mattered was the man waiting for her, the man with whom she would build a life. When she reached the altar, Mr. Collins placed her hand in Ethan's with a formal gesture that belied the tears in his eyes. Ethan's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, anchoring her in the moment. The minister began the service, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. Penelope and Ethan had chosen traditional vows, finding comfort in the time-honored promises that had bound countless couples before them. "I, Ethan James Hayes, take thee, Penelope Ann Watson, to be my wedded wife," Ethan said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." When it was Penelope's turn, she spoke the ancient words with equal conviction, her voice clear despite the emotion tightening her throat. The gold band Ethan placed on her finger to join her engagement ring felt right, as if it had always belonged there. "By the power vested in me by God and the Dakota Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled at Ethan. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet unmistakably heartfelt. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Hayes for the first time, The church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration that followed at the schoolhouse lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned with food contributed by every family in the community, while the same musicians who had played at the harvest social provided lively tunes for dancing. Penelope and Ethan moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from everyone present. "Happy?" Ethan asked during a rare quiet moment, his arm securely around his new wife's waist. Penelope leaned into his embrace, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Completely. And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Thank you for fainting at my door that day." She laughed, the sound bright with joy. "Best bout of heat exhaustion I've ever had." As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays through the schoolhouse windows, Ethan and Penelope bid farewell to their guests. They would spend their wedding night at the hotel in the special suite Mrs. Thornton had prepared, then leave for the ranch, their home, in the morning. Later, alone in the privacy of their suite, Penelope stood by the window watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Ethan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and drawing her back against his chest. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. The new name sent a thrill through Penelope. "I'm thinking how fortunate I am," she replied, covering his hands with her own. "How different my life might have been if I hadn't decided to continue to Custer that day." "I prefer to think we would have found each other somehow," Ethan said. "That some things are meant to be." Penelope turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved features of his face. "I believe you're right," she whispered. "Some things are simply meant to be." As his lips met hers in a kiss no longer constrained by propriety, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had carried her to safety when she had nothing left to give. Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the expanded garden where Penelope knelt, harvesting the season's first ripe tomatoes. Nearby, under the shade of a sprawling cottonwood tree, 3-year-old Samuel played with a set of wooden blocks his father had carved for him, his dark hair so like Ethan's flopping over his forehead as he concentrated on his creation. From inside the cabin, now expanded to include a proper dining room as well as the bedroom and study, came the sound of Ethan's voice singing a lullaby. Their second child, 6-month-old Elizabeth, was fighting her afternoon nap again, and Ethan had volunteered to settle her while Penelope tended the garden. Rising to her feet, basket of tomatoes balanced on her hip, Penelope took a moment to survey the ranch that had become her home. The original cabin was barely recognizable now, transformed over 5 years into a proper homestead. A white picket fence, one of Ethan's surprises for their second anniversary, enclosed the yard where Samuel played. Beyond it, the barn had been expanded to accommodate their growing herd, and a new chicken coop provided fresh eggs daily. In the distance, she could see the one-room schoolhouse that had been built last year, halfway between their ranch and the neighboring Miller property. With 5 school-aged children between the two families, and more in the surrounding ranches, the county had agreed to establish a proper school. Penelope taught there 3 days a week, balancing her love of education with her roles as wife and mother. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention to the road. Shading her eyes against the sun, Penelope recognized Mr. Olson's delivery wagon, right on schedule with their monthly supplies from Custer. "Samuel, Mr. Olson is here," she called to her son, who looked up with excitement. The storekeeper always brought candy for the children, a tradition that made his visits highly anticipated events. Setting her basket on the porch, Penelope smoothed her apron and moved to greet their visitor. As she did, Ethan emerged from the cabin, Elizabeth drowsing against his shoulder, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. "Finally asleep?" Penelope asked with a smile, reaching to stroke their daughter's soft cheek. "Almost," Ethan replied, returning her smile with one that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made her heart skip a beat. "She's fighting it with everything she's got. Just like her father," Penelope teased. "Never wants to miss a moment." Ethan's free arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close for a quick kiss. "Can you blame me? Look at all I'd miss." Together they watched as Mr. Olson's wagon rolled into the yard, Samuel already running to meet it with childish enthusiasm. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light, turning ordinary scenes into moments of extraordinary beauty. "I was thinking," Ethan said, his voice low enough that only Penelope could hear. "Maybe next spring we should start on that second story we've been talking about. With 2 children already, and hopefully more to come." Penelope's hand went instinctively to her abdomen, where the first signs of their 3rd child had begun to make themselves known, a secret she'd been waiting for the right moment to share. "About that," she said, looking up at her husband with a smile that held all the love in her heart. "I think spring might be too late to start building." Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. "Really? When?" "January, I think," Penelope replied. "Dr. Morris confirmed it when I was in town last week." Ethan's whoop of delight startled Elizabeth, who blinked drowsily at her father before settling back against his shoulder. "Another baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Another perfect haze to add to our family." "Perfect indeed," Penelope agreed, leaning into his embrace as Samuel came racing back, eager to share the news that Mr. Olson had brought not only candy, but also a letter from Aunt Margaret in Philadelphia. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they'd worked so hard to tame, Penelope felt a profound gratitude wash over her. From the moment she had fainted from exhaustion at Ethan's door, their lives had been intertwined by fate and choice, hardship and joy, love and commitment. The road hadn't always been easy. There had been difficult winters, failed crops, moments of doubt and fear. But through it all, they had faced life together, their bond only strengthening with each challenge overcome. Looking up at Ethan, who was listening with exaggerated interest to Samuel's excited chatter while still cradling their sleeping daughter, Penelope knew she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought her here to this man, these children, this life they'd built together on the Dakota prairie. It was, in every way that mattered, the perfect happy ending to a story that was still being written, day by day, season by season, with love as its guiding star.